John has started his counting down of the last 7 days of Jesus' life on what would have been, I guess, a Monday, so that the last of day in the 7-day cycle is Sunday, Resurrection Sunday. And so what we're going to look at tonight is what happened on these 2 days in the first set of 7, and think about, because this is a big deal, like what is John using to parallel with the resurrection? So, jumping in to John chapter 2, and what are the first words? On the third day. If you've read this gospel before, what is the first thing that's going to pop into your head when you think of on the third day? Jesus rose, right? On the third day, Jesus rose. Now, the first time you go through this gospel, and you've never heard this story before maybe, like that may not be. You're just thinking, okay, it was just day 3 of after, Jesus met Philip and Nathanael and is like, hey, let's go into Cana. And they're like, okay. And then, on the third day after that, so that means what happened on day 6 in this first 7 days? Nothing. They're traveling. They're traveling from where they were hanging out, where Jesus met with Andrew and Peter and Philip and Nathanael and John, and now they're traveling. And so they arrive on the 7th day of this first set of 7. So, but John is teaching us, like when we read his gospel, like reading it one time is not enough. You have to read it over and over and over again, just like the rest of the Bible. The more you read it, the more of these things that will begin to pop out at you, and you'll start to realize that nothing in the Bible is there by accident. There aren't any details that have been placed there just because they had to fill a page. They didn't have a word count that they had to hit, with any of these books. And, especially when you're talking about people that are, John is a Jew, and his Bible is the Hebrew Bible. And you look how the Hebrew Bible is written, they're so sparse when it comes to the kind of details that especially like Westerners really want when they read a story. Like we want to know like what everything looked like. We love pages. Like I think a great example of this is J.R.R. Tolkien, who can write, it seems like chapters and chapters on what the trees look like. And describing the minute details. And that's like a big thing in like Western literature is, to be able to really put you in the scene and just describe for you what it smelled like, what it tasted like, all of those things, the vividness of the colors. But Eastern writers were totally comfortable with letting your imagination fill in all of those blanks and just giving you just enough details so that the details that they do give you, you recognize are super important. So that's why, a lot of major characters in the Hebrew Bible, we have no idea what they look like most of them. We don't know what color their hair was, their eyes were, we don't know if they're, majority. There's a few that we do, right? And when we are given a physical description of someone, it ends up being super important about who they are, their personality, something about what's foreshadowing, what's going to happen, and the fact that we're told that Esau was a big hairy guy is going to become important later on in the story. We need to know that detail. The fact that Jacob is really smooth-skinned is an important detail that tells us not only something about his personality, but helps explain why he has to use goat hair to imitate his brother later on. Like these details are super, super important. So, and John's writing, I think, from that tradition. And so the details he gives us are super important and are meant to be pondered and reflected on and prayed over as we read his gospel. So on the third day, there's a wedding at Cana in Galilee. And John doesn't tell us whose wedding it was. He doesn't give us the names, like none of those details, because those details are not something that he doesn't want us to get lost or focused on those kinds of details. He's not trying to be a news reporter and just report facts to us. He's drawing our attention to specific things. And we need to know that, one, there was a wedding and that it happened we need to know what day it was because we're still tracking. So what do we have on the first set? We have wedding that's going to be paralleled with Jesus' resurrection. That's an interesting parallel. So there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and even the fact that he mentions that it's Cana is super significant. Why? Because I said, I think maybe in the very first session, that John, like this outline here, like I didn't make this up, and I didn't have to read some commentary to find it. John gives us the outline and how he uses certain words. So the first 7 days is kicked off by announcing that this is taking place in Bethany. We know that this next 7 days is kicked off because he says it happened at Bethany. And then this next section where we have these 4 symbols, it's kicked off, we're told, in Cana. And wouldn't you know it, when this section of 4 is done, guess where Jesus is going to be? Back in Cana. And so it closes the loop, see? He always closes these loops. And so this section here, you're going to see in chapter 5, there's going to be something about, just abbreviate it, colonnades. There's a scene that takes place right at the beginning of chapter 5 where John points out that there were colonnades there. And you're like, well, that's a weird detail. Why is he giving us that? Why is that important? Well, because he's going to end this section of the 4 feasts by again mentioning that there were colonnades. And so that closes that loop. And so all of these details, and I'm just barely scratching the surface with this stuff, but it's just, I'm pointing this out just to show you how brilliantly this has been written. This is not haphazard, ramblings of somebody who spent time with Jesus. This is when I think about what it means that something is divinely inspired, to me, it doesn't just mean that God caused it to happen, but that there is, in the same way that the tabernacle, this is how I compare the writing of the Bible to something, because it's a physical thing that God produced, but he produced it in partnership with human beings, right? These pages that I have here didn't just float down out of the heavens, and the prophets or the apostles just stumbled upon them in a field and said, look, guys, we found the word of God. And it wasn't, an angel didn't come and dictate line by line and somebody wrote it down. There are other religions that make claims like that about their books, but that's never been the claim of the Bible. The Bible was written by people, right? But we believe that God had a hand in every word that went into it. And so I compare it to, there's a wonderful scene in Exodus. God gives Moses this blueprint for the tabernacle, which is the tent that God is going to, it's going to be his tent amongst them. His presence is going to be there. It's going to be the place where he meets with his people. So it's very special. It's very important. And so God not only gives Moses the blueprint, but then he says, God himself, he doesn't even tell Moses, hey, go find any old craftsman to make all these components for the tabernacle. God's like, I've chosen this guy and this guy and this guy, and they're going to be the craftsmen because they have incredible skill when it comes to, creating the linen curtains, fashioning the golden instruments and implements and all of that. And then God says, but I'm not just going to take some great craftsmen that I've selected. He says, my spirit will come upon them and fill them with wisdom to be able to create these things at a supernatural level. And I believe that's exactly what God did in writing the Bible. He selected people that I think were already probably brilliant writers, and then the Holy Spirit came upon them and enabled them to write the best writing of their lives, to the point that when they took stock of what they had written, they thought, wow, God did this. That's how they knew. That's how they knew. And the people who were around them watching it coming together knew, wow, I'm getting goosebumps as I'm reading this back. This is God, God's thumbprint on his book. Okay, so there's a wedding in Cana, and the mother of Jesus was there, and that's going to become really important. And Jesus was invited to the wedding with his disciples. And when the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Which is interesting, right? Why is that Jesus' problem? Right? And what exactly did she expect Jesus to do about it? John doesn't tell us any of that. He just says that his mother came to him and said, "They have no wine." And Jesus says to her, "Woman, What does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come, which is, again, we should already be used to, here we are, chapter 2, we should already be used to Jesus saying very cryptic things that don't seem immediately obvious to us what he's talking about. What do you mean his hour has not yet come? And what does that have to do with his mother's request that there's the wine ran out, Jesus? And he's relating it to his hour, which, by the way, leading up to this, on day 5, Jesus will say that his hour has come. And looking forward to his death and resurrection. Well, Jesus is saying here the hour has not come. And he asks her, why should he care, basically? Why is it his responsibility that there's no wine? And his mother, look, she doesn't, I think she's really used to Jesus and interacting with Jesus. She's been with him for a long time. And so she just says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Like, she doesn't answer him. She doesn't have a conversation with him about it, because she apparently knows that he knows what she means and that he knows what this has to do with him. And she's already she has faith that Jesus is going to take care of this. Jesus has been alerted that there's a wine shortage at this wedding, and he's going to take care of it. It's just incredible. It's incredible. And what happens? So now in verse 6 it says, there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. So, best case scenario, 6 stone water jars, and they say they hold 30 gallons. I think that's 180 gallons of water that they can hold. That's a lot of water. And Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And then he said to them, now draw out some and take it to the master of the feast. So they took it. And when the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now. So it's hard to even know where to begin with all of the ties that this has to the rest of Scripture. But just looking at it on the surface level, what is happening here? So, and we'll see throughout John, people are always saying things, and I think I mentioned that maybe last week, that people in John's Gospel are always saying things that are more true than they understand. It's ironically true. This guy has no idea that he's drinking miracle wine. He has no idea that this was water, a few minutes before that he's now tasting. But in his mind, what's happened is, this is an act of incredible generosity and hospitality, right? In the Middle East, we love hospitality. We love to put the best before people. But this guy says, but most people, in a little bit of shrewdness, they'll put their best up front. But then after people have been drinking for a while, and they're maybe not as discerning anymore, then you can put the cheap stuff in, and everybody's still happy, everybody still had a great time, and you saved a little bit of money. And this guy's just amazed that anybody would be so outrageously generous that they would actually bring out the good wine at the end, that they'd save the good wine for last. Instead of putting what was best up front, the best comes last. But clearly, this is a miraculous thing that the servants see, the disciples see this. I mean, there's a reason why, John's writing about it. He was a firsthand witness to this. And what are, as they're trying to make that connection, and then on reflection and looking in light of Jesus saying that he is the fulfillment of everything in the scriptures and the Torah and the prophets and in the writings. And so you think about wine and what does wine mean symbolically in the Bible. So I just pulled out a few verses. There's actually, interestingly, in Genesis chapter 49, there's at the end of Jacob's life, so great-grandpa Israel, he's blessing each of his sons, and he's giving a prophetic blessing to each of them, blessing them now, and also giving them a prophetic picture of what they will become, what will come from them. And when he gets to Judah, amongst other things, he calls Judah out as the lion. He's like a lion's cub and all of that. But then he says in Genesis 49:10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until tribute comes to him. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Now this gets really fun. So then it says, binding his foal to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. And, vine in itself let me pause. We'll get there. He has washed his garments in wine, and his vesture in the blood of grapes. Ooh, it's poetic, but already there's a poetic tie now between blood and wine and the ruler that will come from Judah. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth whiter than milk. And so you think about wine, you think about grapes, and then he throws in the metaphor of milk. His teeth are so white it's like milk. But what does milk make you think of? If you think of milk and grapes, and you're an Israelite, what are some famous scenes from the Torah that might pop into your brain? The spying out the land, right? Because it's a land flowing with milk and honey. And when they come back, what are the spies carrying from the land? Grapes, like huge bunches of grapes. Like tremendous, abundant grapes. And so then that becomes that metaphor of abundant wine and milk and honey and fruitfulness becomes tied from that point on in Numbers all throughout the rest of the Bible. That becomes tied with the favor and the blessing of God for his people when they enter into their inheritance, right? Because that's what the promised land is. It's their inheritance that was promised to Abraham. And as Abraham's descendants, that's their inheritance from great-great-grandpa Abraham. It's this land that has a blessing on it, that has a blessing of fruitfulness on it. And of course, but what God warned the people through Moses was, God says, I can turn the fruitfulness off like that. Like that, I can end the fruitfulness. I can send drought on the land. I can dry up the land. And actually, I will curse the land. It won't be a blessing, it'll be a curse if you leave me, if you break this covenant promise as a people that you've made to me. This marriage between the children of Israel and their God is like a marriage, that there are vows that they take at Mount Sinai that say, we are married to our God now. He will be our God and we will be his people. And Moses warned them that, hey, if you break your marriage vows, you will no longer be under a blessing. You will actually call down a curse on yourself, and the land itself will be cursed, and you'll actually be kicked out of the land and you'll lose it. And so the fruitfulness of the land then becomes not only synonymous with the idea of their inheritance in the promised land, but of dwelling with God in the land under his blessing, of the people living in a faithful relationship to God. So then when Isaiah talks about the messianic kingdom that is coming, that God himself will usher in, so Isaiah 25, we shouldn't be surprised that this idea of wine jumps back in. So Isaiah 25, which, read the whole chapter later on in your own time. Like, it's amazing the parallels that Jesus is making, I think, between this passage and himself. So starting in verse 6, it says, on this mountain, and the mountain that Isaiah is talking about is Mount Zion, so it's where Jerusalem is. It says, on this mountain, Yahweh of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow. So it's like, meat with the bone in, it's cooked, it's juicy, delicious, right? Of aged wine, well refined. So it's like the best wine you could ever drink. In the Messianic kingdom, we're going to drink the best wine. And so while God's people are just eating up this delicious food and drinking this delicious wine, God will actually also be swallowing something. But look what it says in verse 7. He says, and he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. And the Lord Yahweh will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth. For Yahweh has spoken. And it will be said on that day, behold, this is our God. We have waited for him, that he might save us. This is Yahweh. We have waited for him. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. Now, of course, when Isaiah talks about, rejoicing in the salvation of God, that's just another hyperlink back to Exodus and the first time that we see salvation talked about, right? Which is when the Israelites are at the Red Sea, they're trapped between the sea, which is represents death. And there's the army of Pharaoh coming down, wanting to drag them back into slavery, and they're caught, just hemmed in between death and slavery. And the people think that this is the end and that they're just going to be buried out there. And Moses says, basically, everyone hush down, be quiet. All you have to do is be still and see, be still and watch the salvation of Yahweh. And see how he will fight for us. And then, of course, the Spirit of God comes as Moses stretches out his hand over the sea, and the seas part, and the people find life through death and get to enter into their covenant relationship with God on the other side. But that Exodus story, from that point on, then becomes forever for the rest of the Bible. Anytime a Jewish person sees talking about salvation and rejoicing in salvation, it always goes back to them thinking of that first Exodus and God rescuing them through the Red Sea. And of course, what happens right after that? We have a song. We have Exodus 15, this great song that they sing. God rescues his people, and then his people sing a song about God rescuing his people. And that's why the psalmist will say, we sing to the Lord a new song. Right? Because our as the people of God, we all have a salvation story to tell, and it should bring us to sing. We all have a song to sing. And every time God rescues another person, there's another opportunity to sing a new song, because a new person has been saved. God has come through yet again. And so that's that whole rejoicing and salvation in Isaiah 25 is hearkening back to that. So this is talking about the time when God will bring about the new exodus of bringing his people, buying his people out of slavery, of rescuing them from death. When that happens again, there's going to be delicious wine, and God will swallow up death on this same mountain, on this mountain where Jerusalem is. And you see now how this wedding is drawing some really tight parallels and connections to Jesus' death and resurrection, right? Because what did Jesus swallow up on that cross? He swallowed up death. So here's just a few other verses. So Joel 3, verse 18, it says, and in that day, there's a lot of these in the prophets, you'll see talking about that day, or the day of the Lord. And it's talking about that time when God breaks in to the story, when God himself shows up to rescue his people Israel. So it says, the mountains shall drip sweet wine, and the hills shall flow with milk. And all the stream beds of Judah shall flow with water. You can see how it's pulling a lot of that same imagery that I read from Genesis 49 of milk and wine and Judah, right? A fountain shall come forth from the house of Yahweh and water the valley of Shittim. And one more for fun. So Amos 9. Behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes, him who sows the seed. The mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. This time now the hills are flowing with wine. And I will restore the fortunes of my people Israel, and they shall rebuild the ruined cities and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and drink their wine. And they shall make gardens and eat their fruit. And there's that garden imagery. It's the idea of like going back to the Garden of Eden, going back to that place where, we are one with God, walking with God, in intimacy with God. So when Jesus turns water to wine, he's doing a lot of things. And one of the things, Brian and I were talking about this earlier, that, why did Mary, Jesus' mother, care that the wine was running out? As a mom, why would she care about that? What would happen in that culture? They're celebrating, the wine's flowing, but then it's run out. What's going to happen for the bridegroom and his bride in their community? Right? Well, because yes, they're going to be shamed, right? Because once the wine stops, well, party's over. See you later, right? Like it's an embarrassing thing. It means that they either didn't plan well, they didn't have enough money, whatever. There was a reason why the wine ran out. And whatever the reason was, the fact that it had run out was going to bring embarrassment and quite possibly shame on the bridegroom and his bride. And, Mary as a mother, and probably having compassion on this sweet young couple who are, beginning their lives together, doesn't want them. This just feels like there should be a better resolution to this story for them. And so she just goes to Jesus and Jesus, you can take care of this. You can cover their shame. You can rescue them from this embarrassment, and you can actually turn their wedding day into something very special. Now, did Mary know exactly what Jesus was going to do or how that was going to work? Probably not, but she knew he could do whatever he needed to do to rescue them from this situation. And obviously, Jesus, whether he responds out of the same compassion for this couple or simply the being moved by the faith of Mary, that she didn't even feel like she needed to explain to him the reason why. When he asked, what does this have to do with me? And she's just just do whatever he says, guys. I trust. I don't have to even make my case to him. I just have to point out to him that there's a need. And I trust that he's going to meet it. That's just, that level of things, so amazing. And we could spend all night talking about that. But then on the other level, that the wine then becomes this amazing symbol of every story about grapes and wine and the fruitfulness of the land and all of that, and that Jesus produces it himself. He produces this wine himself. That it comes from him, and that he is the fulfillment of all of these things, and that he turns what is just an ordinary Jewish wedding into what? Look what John calls this. This is in verse 11. This is the first of his signs Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. And we're thinking, it's so easy to think of it as it's not that big a deal. right? He made some wine. But John recognizes that as that this then becomes, this wedding becomes, sign number one. And we're going to find out really quick that John, and we talked about in the very first time that in the epilogue, he shares how, he could have written so many things about Jesus. There aren't enough books in the world to contain it. And so he's letting us know, I carefully curated and selected the stories I was going to tell you about Jesus for a very specific purpose and with a very specific agenda. And it's interesting that when John uses the word sign, he doesn't use that word flippantly or casually. There's only a small number of things that Jesus does in John's gospel that John will call out and say this was a sign. And this is the first one. He'll say this is sign number one. In a little while, in a few weeks from now, we'll get to one where Jesus will do something and we'll be told, John will tell us, and this was sign number 2. And then after that, he stops counting. And he expects us to keep track ourselves. He's taught us that we should be counting, but he's not going to let us be lazy. He wants us to continue to count ourselves. And wouldn't you know it, Lazarus becomes sign number 6. And then he doesn't call anything else a sign explicitly after that. But there is a 7th sign, but he doesn't have to call it a sign over here in 20, right? It's the resurrection. And we'll see, we probably won't get to it tonight, but in very shortly in chapter 2, Jesus himself will say that the only sign he'll give the Pharisees is the sign of tear this body down, this temple down, and I'll raise it up again. John's already sneakily called it a sign way up here in advance. He's called it out for us, that this is going to be the 7th sign. And so the 7th sign takes place on day 7 of the second set of 7. So do you see how? So this is the 7th sign. And so the 2 weeks, first sign, and then the last sign. And what is it remember, John's not giving us dialogue for the sake of entertaining us. He's giving us very specific dialogue that means what it says and more. And so when the master of the feast says, you've saved the best for last. So this is the first sign. Is this the best sign? Nope. Jesus has saved the best sign for last because his hour has not yet come, where he has swallowed up death forever and opened the gates wide for all of his people to enter into their inheritance and come into the blessing of God and the fruitfulness of God and all of this. And when it says the disciples saw this, and they recognize that this is manifesting God's glory. What does that mean? Again, what does glory mean? When John talks about glory, he's talking about the visible splendor of God, the divine beauty of God, not just the honor of God, not just the weightiness of God. He's saying that, and literally the what we can see with our eyes, what we can touch with our hands, like it's something tangible. It's tangible glory. And they tasted this wine and they said, we are tasting God's glory right now. Like they recognized that there was something supernatural, divine about this wine that they were drinking at this party and that it happened at a wedding. Like it just blew their minds. And they were told that they believed in him. They trusted him, trusted in him by this. Now, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to do it anyway. Do they really understand what it means to believe in him at this point? No, because we're going to see in a little bit, like they're having a hard time keeping up with what Jesus is revealing about himself. It's only after his death and resurrection that suddenly they begin to get it. Suddenly, as they look back, they begin to understand what Jesus was saying all along. Suddenly, they begin to understand that he was everything they thought he was, but oh, so much more. So much more. But what they see and what they can receive right now, they're latching on to. And then we're told, and then after this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there. Now it says for a few days. How many days? We don't know. Why does John not tell us? Because he wants us to know you can stop counting days now. Now that we've counted out 7 days, I'm not going to count out any more days for you. He'll pick that up again and he started it off mentioning Bethany. He'll pick that up again when he mentions Bethany again, and then he'll start counting down this day, this day, this day, this day. So from this point on until John chapter 12, We're not keeping track of exactly what the time frame is. I mean, we'll know that, oh, this is a certain day, a certain feast, whatever, but he's not keeping track like day by day, blow by blow like that until John chapter 12. So I'm going to stop there because, oh my goodness, the next thing Jesus does. So Jesus, the first of the first symbols is the wedding. He takes a wedding, and I say this ordinary Jewish wedding, and he makes it about himself and his coming kingdom and what he's there to do for all of them and what he's going to be making available for all of them. And then the second thing will be the temple. And oh my goodness, we could spend an hour talking about the temple, and we might do that next week. I don't know. But we'll get as far into it as we can. So I'm going to stop there. But I am in awe of how amazing your word is, how the scriptures are so deep. I feel totally inadequate to plumb the depths of what you have written, what you have revealed to us in your scriptures, Lord. But we are just so thankful that the invitation from you is just to come and see, to spend time and to read these scriptures, to ask you by your Holy Spirit to bring light and clarity to these passages and to teach us, God. And I honestly, Lord, I'm thankful that it's that way, that we can spend our entire life reading this book over and over and over again. And we will never stop finding new treasures that you have buried for us. We thank you for this miraculous story that is good news. It is not just good news. It is the greatest news on the planet. And God, we just ask you to just rekindle the fire and the passion in us to go and tell others the things that we have seen, what we have experienced, our own personal testimony, God, that we would go out and sing a new song because you rescued us, because you love us and died for us and gave yourself for us.